Snow blew sideways past the window of Calloway and Company Horology when 6 men in black wool coats filled a doorway built for one, and Adrian Voss set a small ring box on the glass counter like the matter was already decided. He did not ask Wren Calloway to marry him. He informed her. Refuse, and the Calloway name would lose its seat at the Concord, the last neutral ground the city's 5 families still respected. Wren looked at the box, then past it, at 5 armed strangers crowding a shop that smelled of clock oil and cedar, and said the one word none of them expected. No. The silence that followed had teeth. Every man behind him braced for the temper that had made Adrian Voss's name a thing people whispered. It never came. He smiled instead, slow and unreadable, and said 4 words that would follow her into every ticking room for the rest of that winter. Ask me again, Wren. It had started 40 minutes earlier, the way trouble with men like Voss always did, quietly, at closing time, on a street already emptied by the cold. Wren had been alone in the back room, easing a hairspring out of a 19th-century carriage clock with a pair of brass tweezers, 40 other timepieces murmuring around her in a shop that never fell entirely silent, when the bell over the front door gave a single, flat note. She didn't need to look up to know something was wrong. The bell rang differently for 6 men than it did for one, and she'd spent enough winters alone in this shop to know the difference in her bones before her mind caught up. She knew who he was before he said a word. Everyone in the North End did. Adrian Voss ran the harbor the way his father and grandfather had run it before him. Quietly, patiently, 3 generations deep, a man who had never once needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. He didn't look like the stories that trailed him through the neighborhood. No scars, no gold, nothing loud. Just a dark navy coat dusted white at the shoulders, ice-colored eyes that missed nothing, and a stillness that filled a room faster than shouting ever could. He crossed to her counter without asking permission and studied the disassembled clock spread across her felt mat, the way a man studies something he already understands better than he lets on. "You're the last Calloway," he said, not a question. "I'm the only Calloway who still answers the phone," Wren said, setting down her tweezers with a steadiness she didn't feel. "My grandfather's been dead 5 years. Whatever debt you think this shop owes your family, take it up with him." "It isn't a debt." Adrian's voice was low, even, entirely without threat, which somehow made it worse. "It's a promise. 40 years ago, my father was 19 and running from men who wanted him in the harbor with rope around his ankles. Your grandfather hid him in the cellar under this shop for 11 days and never told a soul, not even his own wife. In exchange, my father swore that whatever the Calloways ever needed, the Voss family would answer. That debt didn't die with him. It came to me the same week I buried him." "Then answer it with money," Wren said. "I don't want your protection. You already have it, whether you want it or not." He reached into his coat and set down a small, enameled watch, its case cracked, its hands frozen at 3:10, the glass over the dial spidered like frost. "This belonged to my father. Your grandfather was supposed to be the one who kept the Concord, the truce clock the 5 families still trust, because a Calloway's hands are the only hands none of us have to fear. He died before the tradition passed properly to anyone. Since then, the seat's been empty, and there are people circling it who would very much like to fill it themselves." "Then let them," Wren said. "It's not my war. It's a war built entirely around your family's blood, whether you fight in it or not." Adrian's gaze didn't waver. "The seat isn't a title anyone can buy or forge, Wren. It's tied to the actual craft. The hands that built that clock 60 years ago are the only hands the other 4 families have ever agreed to trust with it. And that trust doesn't transfer to a stranger no matter how skilled they are. It transfers by blood, or it doesn't transfer at all. You're the last one who carries it. If a Calloway isn't standing at that table in 6 weeks, when the Concord meets, the seat goes up for open claim for the first time in 3 generations. And I promise you, the family circling hardest doesn't send men in wool coats to knock politely first." Behind him, the tall one, Silas, she'd learn his name later, shifted uneasily near the window, watching the empty street like it might not stay empty. The quiet one, Emmett, hadn't moved at all, but his eyes tracked every door and shadow in the shop with the flat, practiced patience of a man who got paid to notice exits. "So marry me," Adrian said, and it landed as flat and procedural as a man reading terms off a page. "It puts a Voss ring on Calloway hands. It puts you back at that table under my protection instead of alone and exposed. No one touches what's mine, Wren. Not for 15 years, not once." "I'm not a seat at a table," Wren said, "and I'm not something you inherited along with your father's debts, to be handed off and secured like cargo. I'm not asking you to be grateful, I'm asking you to be safe. You're asking me to disappear into your family the way my grandfather let his disappear into yours." Her voice had gone tight, old grief surfacing faster than she wanted it to, quicker and rawer than she'd meant to let anyone see. "My mother left when I was 6 because she couldn't live in a house that owed men like you 11 days of silence for the rest of its life. I watched what that promise did to him, the way he flinched every time a car idled too long outside, the way he never once let me answer this door alone after dark. I'm not signing my name to the same thing just because you showed up with a ring and a deadline." Something shifted behind Adrian's eyes. Not anger, something closer to respect, which was somehow more unsettling than anger would have been. He picked the ring box back up off the counter, turning it once in his gloved fingers, unhurried, like he had all the time in the world despite the deadline he'd just named. "No," Wren said again, steadier this time, because she needed him to hear that the first one hadn't been fear-talking, and the second one wasn't either. That was when it happened. The moment his men would replay in low voices for weeks afterward, in bars where nobody official could hear them. Adrian Voss, who had by every account in the neighborhood put 2 men in the harbor for lesser insults than being told no in front of his own crew, simply smiled. It reached his eyes. It looked, absurdly, like relief. "Ask me again, Wren," he said, and closed the box, and slid it back into his coat instead of leaving it behind on her counter, the way she'd braced for. "When you understand exactly what you're refusing," Silas actually turned his head to look at him, some silent question passing between them that Wren couldn't read. Emmett's hand, which had drifted an inch toward his jacket the second Wren said no, eased back down slowly, like he wasn't entirely sure he was allowed to relax yet. Nobody in that shop had expected the sentence to end that way, least of all Wren, who had spent the last 5 minutes bracing for something closer to a threat than a riddle. "The Concord meets in 6 weeks, Adrian said, already turning for the door, leaving the cracked pocket watch sitting on her counter like an afterthought that wasn't one. "Fix that if you want. Professional courtesy. I'll be back to collect it." He paused at the threshold, snow gusting in around him, cold air rushing past his shoulders into the warm, ticking dark of her shop. "And Wren, whoever's been sitting in the gray sedan across the street for the last 3 hours isn't one of mine. You might want to lock the back door tonight." The bell rang once more as the door swung shut behind 6 men, and Wren was alone again with 40 ticking clocks, a cracked pocket watch she hadn't agreed to fix, and a question she couldn't put down. If the danger sitting outside her shop wasn't Adrian Voss, then who was it? And how long had they been watching her before he ever walked in to complicate things further? She didn't sleep that night. She sat at her workbench with the shop's single lamp burning and her grandfather's old service revolver, never fired, kept only because he'd insisted a locked shop full of strangers' valuables deserved one, within reach on the shelf, listening to every car that passed on the slush-choked street outside. The gray sedan didn't return, or if it did, she didn't see it through the frosted glass. What she found instead, near dawn, tucked into the crack of her back door where the old wood had swollen and never quite sealed, was a folded scrap of paper with no signature. 6 words, typed, unceremonious as a receipt. "The keeper's seat isn't yours yet." She called the only person left alive who might know what that meant. Elias Pruitt had been her grandfather's oldest friend, a locksmith 2 streets over who'd known Abraham Calloway since they were boys running the same cold alleys behind the fish markets. He was 71, half-deaf in one ear from a lifetime of drills and hammers, and the only person Wren trusted enough to ask about her family's strangest inheritance. He let her in before sunrise, made bitter coffee neither of them drank, and listened to the whole story without once looking surprised. which frightened her more than anything Adrian Voss had said the night before. "Your grandfather never told you what the Concord actually was," Pruitt said, not a question, setting the note down on his cluttered workbench between two half-finished padlocks. "He told me it was a clock, some kind of ceremony every couple of years. I thought it was sentimental nonsense he kept alive because it made him feel important. It's older than that, and meaner." Pruitt turned the note over in his weathered hands, studying the typewritten letters like he half recognized the machine that made them. 60 years ago, 5 families in this city were about to burn it down, fighting each other over harbor rights. Ships sinking that weren't supposed to sink. Fires that weren't accidents. Your great-grandfather built a clock, an astronomical piece, brass and glass, absurd, beautiful thing, the whole solar system turning on its face, and offered it to all 5 as a truce piece. Whoever holds it between meetings can't move against the others without breaking a promise. Every family in this city still takes dead seriously, because the Calloways who build and keep it have never, not once in 3 generations, taken a side. That neutrality is the whole point of the thing. It's why nobody's ever laid a hand on your family, even during the ugliest years, when half the harbor was on fire and the other half was burying people. You're not just clockmakers to these people, Wren. You're the only referee any of them trust to hold the whistle. And if the seat's empty, then it's up for claim by whoever can prove themselves worthy of it in front of all 5 families at the next Concord. Worthy meaning strong enough, backed enough, that nobody in the room dares argue. Voss wants you in that chair because he needs the Concord's protection more than he's telling you, I'd wager. And somebody else, he tapped the note twice with a thick finger, clearly doesn't want a Calloway back in it at all. Your grandfather nearly lost the seat once himself, you know. Years before you were born. A rival tried to prove the Calloway craft had gone soft, tried to get his own man installed as keeper. Abraham spent 4 months proving him wrong, piece by piece, in front of men who wanted an excuse to bury him instead. He never told you that story either, I imagine. No, Wren said quietly. He didn't. Who's circling now? Pruitt's face went carefully blank in a way she recognized instantly from her grandfather. The particular stillness of a man deciding how much truth a person could carry before it broke something in them. Ask Voss, he said finally. It's his mess as much as yours now. Let him clean it honestly, in front of you, or don't get any further into it than you already are. And Wren, lock your doors. Whoever left that note wanted you to know they could reach you without Voss noticing. That's not a threat from a stranger. That's a threat from somebody patient. She left Pruitt's shop with more questions than she'd walked in with, and one plan already forming that she hated. She was going to find Adrian Voss and make him explain himself, on her terms this time, in his territory, without 6 armed men deciding how the conversation went. The Voss Trading Company occupied 9 floors of a converted grain warehouse on the harbor, glass and old brick stitched together, legitimate enough on paper to fool a bank examiner, and nobody who actually worked the docks. Wren walked in wearing her work coat and steel-toed boots, smelling faintly of clock oil, and watched the receptionist's polished composure crack at the sight of her. Mr. Voss isn't taking visitors this morning. He left something on my counter he didn't ask permission to leave. I'm returning the favor. Wren was already past the desk, and something in the set of her shoulders made the receptionist decide, wisely, not to physically stop her. A man in his 50s intercepted her near the elevators instead, silver at the temples, sharp gray suit, the particular watchfulness of someone who'd survived a long time in a dangerous business by never once being caught off guard. You're the clockmaker, he said, not unkindly, but not warmly either. I'm Marcus. I keep the books straight and the temper in check around here. Mr. Voss doesn't usually let strangers walk his floors uninvited. I'm not a stranger. I'm the debt he says he owes. Wren didn't slow down. Which floor? Marcus studied her for a long moment, something calculating behind his eyes, and then, unexpectedly, almost smiled. 7th, he said. For what it's worth, he hasn't smiled at anyone in this building in about 4 years. Whatever you said to him last night, it's the first time I've heard him laugh about a business problem instead of solving it with his hands. She found Adrian 2 floors up, alone at a drafting table covered in shipping manifests, sleeves rolled to the elbow, looking up at the sound of her boots on hardwood, with an expression that flickered, just once, just barely, into something like surprise before the stillness reclaimed his face. "You came to me," he said. "I came to ask what I'm actually refusing, since you seemed so sure I didn't know." She dropped the typed note on his desk, watched his jaw tighten before he'd even finished reading it. "Somebody left this on my back door last night. Somebody who was watching my shop for 3 hours before you even showed up with your ring box. Elias Pruitt says my grandfather nearly lost that seat once, years ago, to someone circling exactly the way this note sounds. Who's the keeper's seat supposed to belong to if it isn't me?" "Dragunov," Adrian said, the name landing in the room like something heavy set down carefully so it wouldn't break. "Who's Dragunov?" The second oldest family at that table, and the hungriest. Nikolai Dragunov has wanted the keeper's seat under his own control for 15 years, because whoever holds the Concord effectively holds the only leverage none of the other 4 families can touch, a piece of ground nobody's allowed to burn. He spent the 5 years since your grandfather died trying to get his own people installed close enough to the craft to claim legitimacy. He can't force it outright. Tradition says the seat's blood-claimed until a full cycle passes unclaimed, and that cycle ends at this Concord. 6 weeks. He set the note down carefully, like it might still be armed. If you're not sitting in that chair by then, backed by a family strong enough to make the claim stick against a challenge, Dragunov's people walk in and take it, and there won't be a neutral seat left in this city ever again. Just his hand on the only clock everyone else is forced to trust, forever. "So your proposal wasn't really about your father's promise at all," Wren said slowly. "It's about keeping Dragunov's hands off the Concord and calling it a debt so it sounds cleaner. It's about both, and I won't insult you by pretending otherwise." For the first time since she'd met him, something in his voice sounded almost tired. "I owe your family a debt I intend to pay whether you marry me or not. I'll put men on your shop starting tonight regardless of what you decide, because Dragunov already knows your name, and that means you're a target no matter what happens between us. But the seat only holds if the bond backing it is real, not staged, not extorted. The old families aren't fools, Wren. A forced vow is a hollow one, and Dragunov would tear it apart in front of the entire Concord the moment he smelled the lie in it. I need you standing at that table because you chose to, or I don't need you there at all. A false yes is worse to me than a true no. That's why you told me to ask me again," Wren said, understanding arriving slower than she wanted it to. "Not because you expect me to change my mind out of gratitude, because if I ever do say yes, it has to be a yes nobody in that room can call a lie." "Yes," Adrian said simply, and met her eyes without flinching from what he'd just admitted. "That's exactly it." It was the most honest thing anyone connected to his world had said to her since her grandfather died, and it unsettled her more than any threat could have. "I'm not agreeing to anything," she said, "but I'll fix the watch. Professional courtesy, like you said. And you'll tell me the moment Dragunov's people come near my shop again. Not after, not when it's convenient. The moment." "Every time," Adrian said, and something in the way he said it made her believe him completely, which frightened her nearly as much as the note had. The days that followed fell into an uneasy rhythm neither of them planned aloud. Adrian's men, Silas, broad and watchful, and a wiry, silent one named Tobias, took up a rotation on her street that Wren pretended not to notice, and privately found herself grateful for every time the wind picked up after dark. Adrian himself came by 3 evenings that first week, always after closing, always with some fresh excuse. A question about the watch's provenance, a delivery of a rare mainspring she hadn't been able to source in months from a supplier who'd apparently owed him a favor. Once, simply the truth, stated plainly and without embarrassment, that he wanted to see the shop his father had hidden in for 11 days, and had never once had the courage to visit while Abraham Calloway was still alive to show him around. He was terrible with his hands in ways that surprised her. A man who could, by reputation, dismantle another man's certainty with a single sentence turned out to be nearly useless with a loop and a pair of tweezers. And there was something disarming about watching him fumble a jeweler's screw for the 4th time, jaw tight with the particular frustration of a man unused to failing at anything in front of witnesses. You're gripping it like it insulted you, Wren said, not looking up from her own work. It did. It's the size of an eyelash. Everything in this shop is the size of an eyelash. That's the job. She slid her chair closer, guided his hand without quite thinking about the intimacy of it until her fingers were already wrapped around his, warm against the perpetual chill of his skin. Loosen your wrist. You're not forcing a door. You're asking a small thing to trust you. He went very still under her hand, and when she glanced up, he was watching her instead of the watch. Is that what you did with me? He asked. Asked a small thing to trust you? You're not small, Wren said, and it startled a real laugh out of him, low and unguarded, nothing like the stillness he wore for everyone else in the world, a sound she found herself wanting to hear again before she'd even finished admitting it to herself. They didn't talk about the wedding again that night. They talked about his father instead, the 11 days in the cellar, a story Adrian had only ever heard secondhand until Wren produced her grandfather's old journal and read him the actual entry, written in Abraham Calloway's cramped, careful hand. Fed the boy again tonight. He asked why I was risking my family for a stranger. Told him some promises aren't about the person. They're about the kind of man you intend to be after you've made them. Adrian went quiet for a long time after that, staring at the page like it explained something about himself he'd never had the right words for, something his own father had never quite managed to say to him directly. She told him about her mother in return, not the whole of it, just enough. That her mother had married a man who loved horses more than he loved staying alive, and had left when the debts that man left behind turned out to include a promise older and heavier than money. A promise Abraham Calloway refused to break even when it cost him his own daughter's presence at his table. That Wren had grown up in this shop, being raised by a grandfather who taught her to fix broken things because, she suspected now, he couldn't fix the one thing he'd broken by keeping his word. I used to think he chose the Concord over us, Wren admitted. Now I don't know what I think. I think, Adrian said carefully, he chose to be the kind of man his promise required. It cost him. It's costing you now, whether you asked for that inheritance or not. I'm not going to pretend it wouldn't cost you again if you said yes to me. He reached into his coat and set the pocket watch, repaired now, ticking evenly for the first time in decades, back on the counter between them, but didn't push it toward her. I just want you to choose it with your eyes open, if you ever choose it at all. Not because you're cornered, because you decided. A week into that fragile rhythm, Adrian asked her to a dinner that wasn't quite a date and wasn't quite business either. A quiet table at a restaurant near the harbor where half the room seemed to recognize him and none of them said his name out loud. Wren had almost let herself relax over the second course, laughing at something dry Adrian had said about Marcus's endless spreadsheets, when the temperature at their table seemed to drop before she understood why. Adrian. The voice was cultured, warm at the surface and cold underneath, and belonged to a silver-haired man who stopped at their table with the easy confidence of someone who never worried about being unwelcome. And this must be the clockmaker everyone's suddenly so interested in. Nikolai. Adrian's tone didn't change, but Wren felt him go tense beside her, a coiled stillness entirely different from his usual calm. You're a long way from your own territory. A man's allowed to eat where he likes. Nikolai Dragunov turned his attention fully to Wren, and up close he was almost courtly, silver rings on 2 fingers, a smile that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. Miss Calloway, I knew your grandfather briefly, many years ago. A stubborn man, principled in the inconvenient way principled men often are. His gaze flicked, deliberate and unhurried, from Wren to Adrian and back. I do hope you're choosing your alliances more carefully than he chose his. The Concord has a way of punishing people who pick the wrong side of history. I haven't chosen anything, Wren said, matching his composure with her own, refusing to let her voice betray the way her pulse had climbed. I'm fixing a watch. Of course you are. Dragunov's smile widened by a fraction, and it was somehow worse than if he'd stopped smiling entirely. It's a very old, very delicate craft, clockmaking. So easy for outside hands to damage something irreplaceable without meaning to. I'd hate to see that happen to you, Miss Calloway, truly. He inclined his head toward Adrian, precise as a blade sliding back into its sheath. "Give my regards to the Concord. I understand it's overdue for some fresh craftsmanship." And then he was gone, unhurried, back to a table across the room where two of his own men rose to meet him, and the warmth didn't return to the room for the rest of the meal. "He knows I'm working on the clock," Wren said quietly, once he was out of earshot. "That wasn't a warning about the wedding. That was a warning about the escapement." "I know," Adrian said, jaw tight, watching Draganov's table across the room with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not anger exactly. Something closer to a man recalculating a risk he'd underestimated. I don't like how confident he sounded. It was the third week, not long after that dinner, when Draganov's confidence stopped sounding like conversation and started sending men. Wren was alone in the shop past 10, finishing the last of a commission, when the front bell rang wrong, flat, too fast, no pause for a customer deciding whether to enter, and 3 men she'd never seen came through the door with the loose, restless energy of people who wanted an excuse. The one in front had a tattoo climbing his neck and a crowbar loose in one hand, and he didn't bother pretending to browse. "Heard the Voss dog's been sniffing around here," he said, kicking a display case hard enough to crack the glass, the sound sharp and obscene in the quiet shop. "Heard there's a seat up for grabs. Mr. Draganov wants to know if the last Calloway's smart enough to know which family actually wins this." "Get out of my shop," Wren said, already backing toward the workbench, toward the drawer where her grandfather's revolver sat unloaded and useless because she'd never once needed it to be anything else. Her pulse hammered so loud she could barely hear her own voice over it, but she kept it level, because level was the only weapon she had left in that moment. "Not till you tell your boyfriend Mr. Draganov doesn't need his permission to walk these streets." The back door hadn't made a sound, but Adrian was suddenly simply there, the way he seemed to arrive everywhere. Not rushed, not loud, just present. A length of iron pipe he must have grabbed from the alley, loose and easy in one hand. "You're 2 blocks outside Draganov's territory," Adrian said, voice pitched low and utterly without heat, which was somehow worse than shouting. "That's either very brave or very stupid. Which is it?" What followed was fast and ugly and over in under a minute. Adrian moved like a man solving a problem, rather than a man enjoying one, efficient, economical, no wasted motion, and Wren made herself watch instead of look away, because looking away felt like a kind of lying to herself about the world she was standing in, whether she liked it or not. When it was done, 2 of the 3 men were on her floor, and the tattooed one was pinned against her wall, Adrian's forearm across his throat, close enough to whisper. "Tell Nikolai the Calloway seat isn't his to send children after," Adrian said. "Tell him the next ones he sends don't walk out of this shop standing up." After they'd fled, and Silas had arrived to haul the other 2 out into the snow, Wren stood in the wreckage of her own display case, hands shaking now that there was finally time for them to, and found Adrian watching her with something that looked almost like guilt. "This is what I was trying to keep you out of," he said quietly. "You didn't put me in it," Wren said. "Draganov did, the second he decided my grandfather's chair was worth killing over. You just showed up in time." She looked at the cracked glass, at the note she still had folded in her desk drawer, at the man standing in her shop with someone else's blood on his knuckles because of a promise he hadn't asked to inherit any more than she had. "I'm not scared of you, Adrian. I never was. I'm scared of what happens if I keep pretending I can stay out of this." He didn't answer right away. He crossed to her small back office instead, found the first aid kit she kept for the inevitable cuts and burns of her trade, and sat her down at her own work table to clean the shallow scrape she hadn't noticed on her forearm from where she'd stumbled backward into the counter. His hands, so clumsy around a jeweler's screw, were perfectly steady with gauze and antiseptic, and it occurred to her that a man raised the way he'd been raised had probably learned to tend wounds before he'd learned much else. "How old were you?" she asked, watching him work. "The first time you saw something like that happen?" 10, Adrian said without looking up. "My father brought me to my first Concord that year. Not inside. I stood in a hallway with Marcus while 5 men who could have had me killed for looking at them wrong shook hands over that clock. I remember thinking it was the safest room in the city because nobody was allowed to lie in it. Then I watched a man get carried out on a stretcher 2 years later because he tried anyway. He finished taping the gauze, gentler than she expected, and finally met her eyes. I was groomed for this seat the way you were groomed for yours, Wren. Neither of us asked for it. The difference is you still had a door out, until tonight. Did you ever want one? Every year, Adrian said quietly. I never took it. Why not? Because somebody has to be the kind of man who keeps a promise even when it costs him everything, he said. And it was the first time she'd heard something that sounded unmistakably like his own father's voice living inside him. I used to think that made me strong. Some nights it just feels like I never learned how to say no to anything either. Wren reached out, without entirely deciding to, and closed her hand over his where it rested on the table between them. Neither of them said anything else that night, and neither of them needed to. The Concord clock itself arrived 4 days later, delivered under armed guard in 3 velvet-lined crates, and Wren understood the moment she saw it disassembled across her largest work table, why 5 dangerous families had agreed, 60 years ago, to trust their peace to a piece of furniture. It was enormous, brass and blued steel and hand-blown glass, an orrery built into its face so the whole solar system turned with the hours, and it was, unmistakably, broken in ways that went beyond simple age. She spent 2 days going through it, piece by piece, cataloging wear the way her grandfather had taught her, humming to herself the way she always did when a mechanism demanded her full attention. On the 3rd day, deep in the escapement, the small, precise mechanism that gave every clock its heartbeat, she found something that didn't belong. A component too clean, too modern, machined instead of hand-finished, tucked where only someone who understood antique movements intimately would think to hide it. She sat very still for a long moment, loop pressed to her eye, and felt the particular cold that has nothing to do with a Boston winter. She photographed it from every angle before she touched anything else, then called Elias Pruitt with hands that weren't entirely steady, reading him the tiny stamped maker's mark on the underside of the component through the phone. There was a long silence on the other end. That mark belongs to a supplier out of the Harbor District, Pruitt said finally, his voice careful in a way that told her he understood exactly what she was describing before she'd finished. I've only ever seen it on parts sourced through one broker. He does most of his business with the Draganov family. She didn't tell Adrian that night. She told herself it was because she needed to be sure first, and mostly believed it, and stayed up until 3 in the morning with the photograph spread across her workbench, trying to convince herself she was wrong. He found out anyway, 5 days after the crates arrived, because he came by unannounced and found her hunched over the escapement at midnight with a magnifying lamp and an expression he recognized immediately from every dangerous decision he'd ever watched a person make alone. "What is it?" he said. Not a question. He'd learned, apparently, to read her the way she read old movements. She showed him. Explained as simply as she could that the component wasn't decorative and wasn't structural. It sat exactly where the escapement's final release mechanism would trigger during the ceremonial winding. The one ritual moment at every Concord when all 5 family heads stood close together around the clock to watch the hour struck. She couldn't say for certain yet what it did. She could say with total certainty that it had been placed there deliberately, recently, by someone who understood exactly when and where the 5 most dangerous people in the city would be standing when it activated, and that the same someone had almost certainly done it through a broker Draganov trusted with his eyes closed. Adrian went the particular kind of still that Wren now understood meant he was choosing, carefully, not to be the man his reputation promised. "You're not going anywhere near that ceremony," he said finally, flat and absolute in a way she hadn't heard from him since the very first night. "Somebody has to disarm it. I'll have my people handle. Your people can break bones beautifully. None of them can tell a genuine 1890s escapement pin from a machined replacement without me standing over their shoulder telling them which is which. And if they get it wrong in front of 5 armed families, the panic alone kills more people than the device does." Wren set down the loop, hands steadier than she expected. "You've spent 5 weeks telling me this only works if I choose it. I'm choosing it, Adrian. Not the wedding. This. I'm the only person in this city who can walk into that room and take this apart without starting the exact war Draganov's trying to cause. And if I say no, Adrian said, something raw breaking through his composure for the first time. If I lock every door in this city between you and that room, I could do it, Wren. I have men enough. I could keep you safe whether you agreed to it or not. Then you'd become exactly the kind of man you've spent 5 weeks promising me you're not, Wren said quietly, and watched that land harder than anything Draganov had said at dinner. You told me a forced yes was worthless to you. A forced safety isn't so different. He didn't answer that. He left instead, without another word, the bell over her door ringing flat and final behind him. And for one long, cold hour, Wren genuinely believed she'd lost him to exactly the instinct she'd accused him of. She kept working on the escapement anyway, hands moving on their own, because it was the only thing that had ever steadied her when everything else refused to. He came back a little after midnight, snow melting in his hair, and didn't say anything at all at first. He just stood in the doorway and looked at her the way he had that very first night, like he was recalculating something and didn't like where the numbers kept landing. I spent an hour trying to think of a version of this where I keep you out of that room and still respect you in the morning, he said finally. I couldn't find one. Every version ends with me deciding what's best for you the same way Draganov thinks he gets to decide who sits in that chair. I don't want to be a man who protects people by taking their choices away from them. My father was. I watched what it cost him. So what now? Now I trust the woman who spent 5 weeks proving she doesn't need my permission for anything, Adrian said, and crossed the room to stand in front of her, closer than strictly necessary. I'm still terrified. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I'm just done letting the fear make your decisions for you. Something passed between them then that felt heavier and more binding than any ring box ever could. Not surrender exactly on either side, but two people choosing the same risk together instead of one deciding it for the other. If anything happens to you in that room, he said low, there won't be enough of this city left standing to hold another Concord. Nothing's going to happen, Wren said, because I'm going to be very, very good at my job. The night before the Concord, Adrian came to the shop one last time, and for once he didn't come with a supplier's excuse or a question about the watch. He came to brief her, methodical and quiet, spreading a single sheet of paper across her work table with 5 names written in his own hand. Draganov at the top, underlined twice. Below him, the Okafor family, shipping and freight, careful and slow to anger, the closest thing the Concord had to a conscience. The Reyes family, construction and concrete, loud and proud and easily insulted, quick to take offense at anything that looked like disrespect to tradition. The Calder family, the oldest of the 5, old money gone quiet and patient, rarely speaking first but always speaking last. And whatever the Calders decided in that room, the others generally followed. Don't address anyone before they address you, Adrian said. Don't apologize for anything, even instinctively. It reads as weakness in that room, no matter how politely it's meant. And whatever happens, don't look to me for permission. The seat you're standing in doesn't answer to me. That's the entire point of it. You almost sound nervous, Wren said. I am, he admitted. And it cost him something to say it plainly, she could tell. I've watched grown men who've killed for a living go pale walking into that room. I keep picturing you in the middle of it instead of behind a workbench with a locked door between you and everyone dangerous in this city. He folded the paper closed, set it down, and for a moment let the stillness slip entirely, just for her. I'll say it one more time, and then I won't say it again. You can still walk away tonight. Nobody will think less of you, least of all me. I'll find another way to hold that seat, or I'll lose it, and I'll survive losing it. I would rather lose a chair at a table than lose you in that room tomorrow. I know, Wren said, and reached for his hand across the table the way she had 100 times now over smaller, gentler things. That's exactly why I'm going. A man who'd rather lose the thing he spent his whole life protecting than risk me is a man worth walking into that room for. Not because you asked, because I want to be standing next to you when it's finally over, instead of hearing about it secondhand. He didn't say anything else. He just held her hand a long time in the ticking quiet of the shop, and neither of them slept much that night, and in the morning they walked to the harbor together, side by side, neither one in front of the other. The Concord convened on the 9th floor of Neutral Ground, an old shipping exchange no family owned outright, chosen generations ago precisely because none of them trusted meeting on anyone's home territory. Wren stood at the center of the room in her work clothes, tool roll in hand, while 5 family heads and their guarded entourages filled the space around her with the particular tension of predators forced to share a den for one careful hour. Nikolai Dragunov stood directly across the reassembled clock from her, silver-haired, composed, watching her with the same courtly, unbothered interest he'd shown across a dinner table weeks earlier. And beside him, half a step back, a narrow man in an ill-fitting suit whom Adrian had introduced only as Dragunov's supply broker, the man who'd sourced half the clock's replacement parts over the years, trusted enough by long tradition to be allowed close to the mechanism without question from anyone in the room. The ceremonial winding began the way it always had, a slow, formal ritual, the acting keeper turning the great key 13 times while all 5 heads gathered in close around the case to witness the hour struck. Wren's hands did not shake as she lifted the key, though every part of her wanted them to. She turned it once, twice. On the 9th turn, with the room's attention fixed on the orrery's slow, gleaming rotation, she let her free hand drift along the escapement's edge, fingertips finding the modern component exactly where she'd left it in memory, and felt, beneath the brass, the faint, wrong warmth of something drawing power. "There's a problem with the mechanism," she said, loud enough to carry, calm enough not to break the room's fragile decorum. "I need everyone to step back 3 feet, slowly. This is a maintenance matter, not an alarm." It bought her exactly the room she needed, and not 1 inch more. She worked fast, murmuring a running commentary of ordinary clockmaker's language, spring tension, gear wear, nothing that would spook 5 men trained their entire lives to read a lie in a stranger's voice, while her actual attention narrowed to the single modern pin nested against the release lever, timed, she now understood with sick clarity, to complete its circuit the instant the 13th turn struck the hour, while every family head in the city stood close enough to touch one another. "This part," she said, holding up the machined pin between 2 fingers for the whole room to see, hands finally deliberately steady, "isn't 60 years old. It isn't even 10. It's stamped with a maker's mark I've seen exactly once before, on the underside of a replacement barbette supplied for last year's routine service, sourced through a broker who does most of his business, I'm told, with the Dragunov family." She turned, meeting Nikolai's eyes directly, refusing to let her voice shake even as the whole room's attention swung like a blade toward him. "Someone on your payroll has been inside this mechanism for months, Mr. Dragunov, and they weren't fixing anything." The broker moved before Dragunov could speak, lunged, not for a weapon at first, but for Wren herself, one arm closing hard around her throat, hauling her back against him, his other hand diving for something inside his jacket while he shouted for everyone to stay back, that the device would still finish arming if the winding wasn't stopped cleanly, that he could still trigger it manually if anyone came closer. Silas surged forward on instinct, and 2 of Dragunov's own guards blocked him without thinking, the whole room's fragile order fracturing in half a second. 5 family heads and their men caught between the certainty of violence and the uncertainty of a device none of them understood. For one suspended, airless second, Adrian himself was 3 men deep in the crush, too far, and Wren understood in that same second that no one else in the room was going to reach her in time. She still had the pin in her hand. She didn't fight the arm around her throat. She reached instead, fast and precise, the way she'd reached into 1,000 delicate movements before this one, and drove the pin straight back into the escapement's release channel, not to arm it further, but to jam the very gear the broker needed engaged to trigger his manual release, seizing the mechanism dead in its tracks the instant before his thumb found the switch hidden in his pocket. The device gave a single, sickly click and went silent. Nothing happened. Nothing was ever going to happen again. The broker, realizing a half-second too late that the trigger in his hand now closed on nothing, made one last desperate grab toward the clock itself, dragging Wren half off her feet with him. And that was the half-second Adrian finally broke free of the crowd. He crossed the room faster than anyone in it had ever seen him move, hauled the man off her with a force that sent them both crashing into an overturned chair. And it was over almost before the rest of the room had finished flinching. Silas and Tobias already moving to pin him down, Draganov's own guards, to their credit, making no move to intervene on their employer's man's behalf. Nikolai Draganov stood very still in the sudden ringing silence, the color gone from his face, 5 family heads worth of accusing eyes swinging slowly toward him instead of toward Wren. "I didn't order this," he said. And for a man who ruled through certainty, he sounded, for the first time in the room's memory, genuinely uncertain of anything at all. "Then you'll have no objection to the commission examining your man's finances, his phone, and every part he's sourced for this clock in the last 2 years, said Calder, the eldest of the 5, in a voice so quiet the whole room had to lean in to catch it, which was, Wren understood now, exactly why he never had to raise it. Reyes, younger and hotter-tempered, was already on his feet, jabbing a finger toward the broker still pinned beneath Silas and Tobias. "You brought a device into a Concord ceremony, rigged to kill 5 families in one strike, under a neutral roof we've all sworn on for 60 years. That's not ambition, Nikolai. That's a declaration of war you didn't have the courage to make honestly." "It was not sanctioned," Draganov said again, sharper now, aimed as much at his own men as at the room. Beside him, Okafor said nothing at all for a long moment, simply studied Wren with an expression that wasn't quite approval and wasn't quite suspicion either, and then gave the smallest possible nod, not to Draganov and not to Adrian, but to her. The first acknowledgement any of the 5 had offered since she'd walked into the room. "Then prove it," Calder said, and something in the room's balance of power visibly, irreversibly shifted away from Draganov, and did not shift back for the rest of that meeting, or, Wren suspected, for a long time afterward. Wren stood at the center of it all, chest heaving, the pin still clenched in her fist hard enough to leave a mark, and understood with sudden, complete clarity that she had just done the one thing her grandfather's 11 days in a cellar had never quite managed. She hadn't just kept the peace, she'd earned the chair, in front of the only people whose opinion of it had ever mattered. It was nearly an hour before the room emptied enough for Adrian to find her again, sitting on an overturned crate beside the now silent clock, hands finally shaking now that there was nothing left to hold steady for. He crouched in front of her without a word, and simply took both her hands in his, steadying them the way she'd once steadied his around a jeweler's screw. "You could have died in there," he said, voice rough in a way she'd never heard from him. "So could you. Every day you've had that seat." She looked at him, exhausted and entirely, finally certain. "I didn't do that for the Concord, Adrian. I didn't even do it for my grandfather. I did it because somewhere in the last 5 weeks, this stopped being your promise to keep and started being something I wanted to protect on my own account, whether you ever asked me anything again or not." Something in his face came undone in a way she suspected very few people alive had ever been allowed to witness. He reached into his coat one last time, and this time when he set the small ring box on the crate between them, he didn't say a single word about promises, debts, or seats at any table. He didn't have to. Wren picked it up herself, turned it once in her fingers exactly the way he had that first night, and opened it before he could. "Adrian Voss," she said, and it was her voice steady now, her choice, no one's hand pushing hers. "Ask me again." He laughed, real, unguarded, the sound she'd first heard over a jeweler's screw and had been quietly hoping to hear again ever since, and asked her, and this time in front of no one but the silent, gleaming clock that had nearly cost them both everything. She said yes. Draganov never recovered the standing he lost that afternoon. The commission's inquiry found what Wren already knew, and what the broker, once separated from Draganov's protection, was in no position to hide. 2 years of quiet payments, a plan drawn up alone, ambition that had outrun its patience. Nikolai kept his seat at the table, chastened and watched, a man who would spend the rest of his career in that city with 4 families' eyes permanently on him instead of one. It wasn't the ending Wren would have chosen if the choice had been hers. It was, Pruitt told her later, exactly how these things were always supposed to end. Not with more bodies, but with a debt called due in the only currency men like that actually feared: reputation, and the slow, permanent loss of it. Back in the shop, weeks later, on the morning of the small wedding neither of them had wanted large, Wren stood surrounded by every clock she'd repaired since she was 9 years old. 40 different mechanisms ticking their 40 different rhythms the way they always had. Adrian arrived early, out of his usual dark coats for once, looking almost unguarded in a way she suspected only this room had ever made him. He held out his father's watch, hers now, fully restored, the case polished smooth where the crack had been, and fastened it gently around her wrist instead of a ring. "The ring's still coming," he said, catching her look. "I wanted you to have something that already knew how to keep time with you first." Wren looked down at the watch, then up at him, and reached for his hand the way she had that very first evening over a jeweler's screw. Except this time she didn't guide it toward a mechanism. She drew him down to her instead. The kiss was unhurried, in a way nothing between them had been allowed to be until now. No deadline behind it, no room full of dangerous men waiting on the other side of it. Just two people who'd spent 5 weeks choosing each other in small, careful increments, finally allowed to choose all at once. Then, for one single second, as the hour turned, every last clock in the shop struck together, a thing that had never once happened in the history of that room, and never would again. And Wren decided, watching Adrian watch her with that same slow, unreadable smile from the very first night, that some things really were worth being asked twice. Thank you so much for watching. If Wren and Adrian's story kept you gripped until the very last strike of that clock, hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who love a slow-burn, high-stakes romance. Which moment got you the most? The refusal in the shop, the dinner with Draganov, or the Concord itself? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. Share this with a friend who can't resist a story about earning your happy ending the hard way. And if you're new here, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. See you in the next story.